When the Beatles broke up in 1970, it felt like the end of an era, not just for music, but for an entire generation. For a decade, John, Paul, George, and Ringo had changed the sound of the world. But by the time Let It Be hit the shelves, the unity that once defined them had crumbled under ego, exhaustion, and creative tension. And yet, years later, John Lennon would admit that there was one song, one melody so powerful, so timeless, that could have brought the Beatles back together. A song he said should have reunited them. That song was Yesterday.
All my troubles seem so far away.
In 1965, Paul McCartney woke up with a tune in his head. He rushed to the piano beside his bed and began playing what would later become Yesterday. At first, he thought he had accidentally copied someone else's song. It felt too natural, too perfect to be original. He played it for friends, family, and fellow musicians, asking, "Have you ever heard this before?" No one had. Soon he realized it was his. But when Paul brought Yesterday to the Beatles, it felt unlike anything they'd done before. It wasn't a rock song. There were no harmonies from John or George, no driving rhythm from Ringo, just Paul, his acoustic guitar, and a string quartet. The others respected it, but they didn't really feel connected to it. John especially thought it was too sentimental, too far from the energy that made them the Beatles. Still, he couldn't deny how beautiful it was. Years later, Lennon would look back on Yesterday with a mix of admiration and regret, calling it one of the most perfect songs ever written. When Yesterday was released, it was credited to Lennon-McCartney as usual, but everyone knew it was Paul's creation alone. It became an instant classic, covered by thousands of artists, played in every corner of the world, and hailed as one of the greatest songs of all time. John was proud of the Beatles' success, but there was something bittersweet about Yesterday. He saw how it connected to people emotionally in a way few songs ever could, and yet it also symbolized the growing divide between him and Paul. It wasn't their song, it was Paul's song. Still, Lennon later admitted that Yesterday might have been the kind of song that could have united them again, not as a band forced together, but as artists who shared something timeless. In a 1970s interview, he said, "That was Paul's baby, and it was beautiful. Maybe that's the kind of thing that could have brought us all back. If we'd remembered what it felt like to make something like that." By the late 60s, the Beatles were no longer four friends chasing a dream. They were businessmen, celebrities, and weary icons carrying the weight of expectation. Paul wanted structure. John wanted freedom. George wanted respect. Ringo just wanted peace. During the White Album and Let It Be sessions, arguments replaced laughter. John and Paul, once inseparable, could barely look at each other. When Yesterday came up in later conversations, it represented something lost, the innocence of their early years, when every song felt like a discovery and not a negotiation. To Lennon, Yesterday wasn't just a ballad, it was a memory of who they used to be, four kids who made music because they loved it. He would later tell friends that if any song could have reminded them of that bond, it was Yesterday. In his early solo interviews, John was often harsh about the Beatles' legacy. He dismissed songs, criticized their image, and spoke with frustration about being trapped in Beatlemania. But over time, his tone softened. When journalists asked him about McCartney's solo work, Lennon was honest, sometimes critical, sometimes supportive. Yet when Yesterday came up, John was clear. He said it was one of the best things Paul ever did, and that it showed how good we were, how good he was. More than admiration, there was a sense of reflection, maybe even guilt. He knew the Beatles could never go back to what they were, but he also recognized that Yesterday had the kind of purity they had all lost. A simplicity that cut through the noise of fame, money, and ego. To Lennon, that was the essence of the Beatles, and Yesterday captured it better than any other song. Yesterday has been called many things: a love song, a lament, a masterpiece. But to John Lennon, it became something symbolic, a reminder of how fleeting everything had been. Even after years apart, he couldn't escape its melody. It played in restaurants, on radios, in the background of his life, a constant echo of the partnership he once shared with Paul. There's a quiet sadness in knowing that Lennon, near the end of his life, looked back at yesterday as a bridge that might have brought the Beatles together again, if only time and pride hadn't gotten in the way. By the late 1970s, there were rumors, whispers that the Beatles might one day reunite. Paul and John had begun speaking again, sharing laughter and late-night calls from New York to London. In one interview, Paul said, "We were friends again. That's what mattered." And though the world would never see a reunion, there's comfort in knowing that in spirit, they had already found peace. When asked years later if he thought the Beatles could have ever made music together again, Lennon smiled faintly and said, "Maybe if we'd all just sat down, picked up our guitars and played Yesterday, maybe that would have done it." It wasn't just a song to him anymore. It was a symbol of what they once had. A simple tune that captured everything the Beatles were: melody, emotion, and honesty. Yesterday reminded John Lennon of what truly mattered. Not the fame, not the fights, but the music. The connection. The feeling of four young men creating something that would outlive them all. Yesterday didn't reunite the Beatles in life, but in spirit, it never stopped holding them together. Even decades after the band ended, the song continues to do what Lennon believed it could: unite hearts, across time, across generations. And maybe, just maybe, that's what John meant all along. That even if the Beatles never came back, the song itself, soft, eternal, and deeply human, would always remind the world of what they once were: